let's get started and edit some landscape photos. And landscape photography is probably my favorite thing to shoot. I love shooting landscapes just because you don't have to really deal with people. You don't have to direct anybody. You can kind of just be there, and it's all about being at the right place at the right time and kind of just searching for light. So let's grab a photo here, and let's go into the edit module. And it's just upside down because I shot it upside down with a tripod, but there you go. Okay, so pretty wide angle shot. I shot this with a 16 to 35 millimeter, and I had a ND filter on it, so you can kind of see the ring for that. So we're definitely gonna have to crop this photo. And cropping, believe it or not, is a huge quintessential part to landscape photography. Cropping can really make a photo look interesting, or it can kind of destroy your foreground and your background and kind of the subject placement. So let's get into cropping a little bit. So when you're gonna crop a photo, you can either head to your left toolbar over here, or you can simply hit C on your keyboard. So C for crop, C will pull up your crop tool. And for those sort of newish users to ON1, once you grab a tool over here from your toolbar, you're gonna have a set of options you can use to modify up top. I'm actually just gonna leave this how it is right now. Actually, let's use a 16 by 9. I thought this was 16 by 9. So let's use a 16 by 9 crop preset. And I'm just gonna drag this in, holding down Shift. I'm just gonna drag this in. And I'm kind of gonna pull it up to this horizon line. And what I'm doing is I'm gonna try to align my sort of subject here, this big rock area, with these rule of third lines. And if you're not familiar with the rule of thirds, it's basically at its core saying, if you put a subject sort of on or around these intersecting areas right here between these 6 lines, or between these 4 lines rather, then you're gonna have an interesting shot. So I'm gonna pull this over just to kind of get this rock kind of directly on these 2 intersecting points. And then I'll have my sun kind of a little bit in the middle of the frame. I could probably even pull this over a little bit more. Probably about right, maybe right there. That looks pretty good. So now we have, our little rock area kind of on this side where it looks like it's on the rule of thirds, so it's a little bit more interesting to the viewer. And now we have our sun kind of in the middle. So what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna level this photo, obviously. It's a little wonky and a little crooked. So a great way to do that is just to simply either click on your leveling tool here, and you can drop a point and drag it across your horizon line. And it will straighten your photo like that. Or you can just click on the corner when you pull up the little rotating option. You can click right there, and it'll pull up a big sort of diagram that'll allow you to just level your photo. About right there. Boom. So now we've cropped our photo. It looks a lot better than it did before. We've removed a lot of that, circular area from our shot, and we've removed some of those ghosted people that were from the left. So now we can start modifying the look of our photo. So now that we've cropped it, now we can move into this Develop tab here, and we can modify the tone and color a little bit. So I actually shot this photo RAW. So if you shoot a photo in RAW format, you can actually go in and you can change the camera profile inside ON1 Photo RAW. So I'm just gonna change my camera profile to landscape. So you'll notice that by changing that, it kind of brought out a lot of the vibrance and added a little bit more exposure to these mid-tone areas. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, boom. So that's just simply by pulling and clicking on a different camera profile. So now I don't really have to do a whole lot inside this tone and color. The only things I would probably do is maybe reveal some of these shadow details. But at the same time, if I go in and I boost some of the darker areas, I'm gonna end up pulling out a lot of the exposure from these clouds. So if I go in and I pull up on the shadows quite a bit, it looks okay. It brings out some of those darker areas, but it's kind of making the photo a little bit flat. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull down on the contrast a little bit. And you'll see that by doing that, it's kind of removing the contrast from my photo, but it's also revealing some of those shadowy tones kind of in my foreground area here. So I'm gonna pull down on it quite a bit. So I have a little bit more exposed area in this foreground. And then I can always pull back on my blacks to bring back in some of that contrast. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, I've kind of revealed these areas a lot and kind of pulled out some of the midtones, but now I don't have any of that detail in my sky. So what we're gonna wanna do is, first things first, I'm just gonna go down and I'm gonna heat up this photo just a hair, just like that, just so it's a little bit more warm. And now we're gonna selectively apply a style to our shot. And the best way to do that is with a local adjustment. So local adjustments are gonna be your best friend when you're post-processing landscape photos, because more often than not, you're gonna have to selectively apply some sort of adjustment to your shot. Whether it be, in this instance, where we're trying to selectively apply an adjustment on these clouds here, or selectively applying detail into a subject, whatever it may be, local adjustments are a handy tool when it comes to post-processing landscapes. So for this local adjustment, what I wanna do is I wanna go in and I wanna bring some detail back into these clouds. And I don't want it to be applied to the entire photo. So I'm basically gonna use this local adjustment here, and it's automatically set to darken, and that's great. So I'm gonna have it set to a darken, so it's gonna remove some of the exposure. And I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna pull up on the contrast, and it's gonna be pretty intense when I paint it on at the beginning. But the great thing about Photo RAW is that you can always go back and you can remove some of the opacity, you can brush it out. So you can really sort of naturally blend any local adjustment that you apply to your photo. So let's go in, I'm gonna pull down on the exposure, add contrast, and I'm also gonna pull back on the structure a little bit, just so it doesn't crunch up the clouds. And now I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna paint this on this cloud area. And we'll just paint it on the sky entirely. And you'll see that does a great job of kind of bringing back in some of that detail, but it's pretty intense. So what we can do is we can go into our local adjustment here, and we can simply pull back on the opacity to make it more or less natural. Maybe about right there. That looks pretty good. One thing to keep in mind, if you are shooting towards the sun, or you're shooting sort of at the light, keep in mind that if you do pull back on the exposure a bunch, like if I pull up this opacity 100%, you'll see in there it kind of gets crunchy wherever you're trying to remove those true white areas. So just be careful whenever you're applying local adjustments or you're modifying your exposure to kind of just let this area be. The more kind of natural it blends in with the other areas of highlights, just kind of the better looking photo you have. So just kind of a nitpicky thing. Just keep in mind when you are applying local adjustments that do deal with exposure. Okay, so now what we want to do, since we've kind of dealt with this top area of our photo, we want to deal with this bottom area of our photo in the foreground. We're going to do that by adding a new local adjustment layer. And for this one, we're going to actually go in and we're going to choose Reveal Shadows, but we're actually going to go in and we're going to pull up on the contrast instead. We're going to leave the shadows how it is, and we're also going to add structure to this one. So we're actually going to apply detail to this foreground area so that it brings out some of that micro contrast and makes that area pop a bit more. So when I did that earlier, you'll notice that I brushed that on the entire sky. So there's two ways that you can apply masks in Photo RAW, and that's with a masking brush or a masking bug. I'm actually going to grab my masking bug up here. You can select it, or you can simply hit M on your keyboard. So M for masking bug. I'm just going to drop this down, and I'm going to flip it around. Like that. Maybe pull that down, pull the feathering down a bit. So now if I turn this off and on, you'll see it does an awesome job of bringing out a lot of those shadowy tones in my foreground, bringing in some detail, but it's a little too much. So we can always go back to that local adjustment layer, and we can simply pull back on the opacity to make it more natural and more blended with the photo. So now let's turn this off and on. Cool. Now we're working with these foreground details, and we're pulling out some of the midtone details as well. So let's just hit the backslash key on our keyboard. And there we go. We're kind of bringing out some more of the darker areas in this photo, but now we want to modify the color because we're making it a little bit flat by kind of pulling out these darker tones in our photo. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into effects here. We're going to add a filter and we're going to add a color enhancer. And the color enhancer is great for modifying the color in your photo. Well, what I want to do to this shot is I want to bring back some of those nice, rich kind of sunset tones that were in this original photo. So all you have to do is just head down to your color enhancer here, and we can just pull up on the vibrance and maybe a little bit in the saturation. And now if I turn this off and on, it does a great job of bringing in a lot of that color and a lot more of that sunset sort of look to this photo. So let's add one last filter here. I'm actually just going to add a sunshine filter. And you'll notice that if I turn this off and on, it really does a good job of kind of boosting this photo up a little bit. What the sunshine filter does is it actually applies a look to your photo that darkens the darker areas in your shot and then brightens the highlights. So technically it gives your photo a sunshine look. And the cool thing about this sunshine filter is that you can modify all of the different details in the sunshine look. What I want to do is I want to make it a little less warm. So I'm actually just going to pull back on the warmth. And I'm going to give it a little bit more in amount. So it makes it a little bit more strong. There we go. Now let's add one last filter, and we're just going to add a vignette. And I like adding vignettes, especially on areas on the beach like this, or if I'm shooting into the sun, because it'll actually kind of bring your viewer's eye into whatever subject you have. So let's just click this big softy. And I'm actually going to pull back on the opacity a little bit. And you'll notice that does a good job of kind of pointing the viewer's eye into this middle area with our sun and our rock, but it kind of gets a little clouded over here. So I'm actually just going to use my masking brush. I'm going to grab that by hitting B on my keyboard again. And now I can simply just brush this area out from whatever subject that I want to kind of see more. And then you can play with the opacity again. Oh, sorry. Play with the opacity of the brush. Oops. To make it more blend. Oops. There we go. Now I can make it stronger. Boom. So now if I turn this off and on, and we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, you know, not a lot of time, we've really brought out a lot of those darker, you know, shadowy tones in our photo, added some detail, brought some of that color back in, and all doing that while not kind of modifying the sky area or removing any detail from the sky. So that's sort of a basic one that we kind of just to start off with. Let's go into a more advanced photo here. Just going to go into browse. Let me just check the comments real quick to see if we have any. No comments so far, so let's go back to our landscape section. Let's go into here. Okay, so I shot this photo at Sparks Lake in Bend, or near Bend. And it's a little kind of off kilter. I think my drone was flying sideways when I shot this photo. So what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna crop it like we did with the last photo. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard, grab my crop tool. There we go. I'm going to head up. I'm actually going to reset this to freeform. And now I'm going to do the same thing like we did earlier. Hold down Shift, pull it in. And for this particular photo, as far as the composition goes, I'm going to want to actually put this mountain kind of in the middle of my photo. And then this is going to be my foreground leading up to my subject, which is basically going to be sort of the backdrop of my shot. So I'm going to sort of center this mountain probably do a little bit more up top here. And now it's still a little kind of off level. So same thing, I'm actually going to go and click, and then I can kind of just turn it until it's more naturally level. Center it again. Boom. Now if I hit enter, voila, we have a centered photo that we can start modifying and adding different things to. So again, I'm going to head back into my develop tab, sort of set the foundational look for my shot. And I'm going to use this camera profile again, and I'm going to choose ON1 landscape. And by doing that, again, it kind of, adds a little bit more detail to the photo, kind of exposes really well for the highlights up here in the mountain, and makes it a little more crisp. So now all I want to do is I want to deal with some of these darker areas in the mountain instead of develop. So I'm actually going to pull back on the contrast a little bit like that. I'm going to pull up on my midtones and my shadows. And then I'm going to head down to my black slider, and I'm going to pull back on my blacks to bring in a little bit more contrast and detail to my photo. And then let's head down and let's actually just heat this photo up just a hair. Boom. So voila, there we go. We have sort of our foundational look and tone for our photo. Now what we want to do is we want to start applying different sort of creative effects to this photo. What I really want to deal with is sort of just the detail in this foreground area, and then sort of the softness of this mountain. So I basically want to apply some detail to this photo, and I also want to go in and add some different creative looks to it. So let's go into effects. I'll add a filter here, and let's just add dynamic contrast. And dynamic contrast does an awesome job of bringing in some nice micro contrast and detail. You'll see that by turning that off and on, it really does a good job of bringing in a lot more detail into this foreground area. Okay, so now let's add another filter. And the filter I want to add is I want to actually add a curves filter. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a curves filter here. And for this particular photo, I want to give it sort of a nice moody look. So inside this tone curve, there's a few different things that you can modify. This first point right here at the bottom left corner is going to be your black point. So this is all your blacks in your photo. And you'll notice that by pulling up on this point, by pulling up on the blacks, it's trying really hard to reveal some of those darker areas. So it's making your photo look a little flat. But this one, this is your highlight point. This top right photo, or this top right one, is your highlight point. Now, if I pull that down, you'll see it's pulling away the highlights from my photo. In between that, right here in this middle area, this is going to be your midtones. So your midtone point is basically going to be in the middle of this tone curve line. So if I pull up on this, it's pulling up on all of those midtones of my photos. I like to think of the midtones as sort of the gray in your shot. So you'll notice that by pulling up on these, I'm basically exposing for more of that gray in my photo. And if I pull down, I'm removing some of that exposure from the gray, which you'll notice that by pulling down on this midtones, it brings in a ton more detail into my mountain here. But I don't like how dark that makes this area. And I want to actually reveal for this area more. So we're going to have to actually selectively apply some different filters to our foreground and then our mountain here. So the first area let's deal with is this foreground area. So let's actually pull, or we'll reset this line. What we're going to do is we're going to add sort of a moody look to this shot. I'm going to pull up on my black point here, maybe right there. And now in this little area in my tone curve, it's going to be my shadows. So if I pull down on that, you'll see that by pulling down on the shadows there, it's bringing in more contrast to my photo. And it's also giving it sort of that hazy, sort of vintage, really strong, maybe about right there. Boom. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to pull up on the contrast a little, or the midtones a little bit. Like that. But if I turn this off and on, oh, it's a little too black down there. So let's move this down a little bit. There we go. So if I turn this off and on now, I like what it's doing to this bottom area, but I don't like what that's doing to the mountain. So I'm going to grab my masking brush by hitting B on my keyboard. Now I have my masking brush. It's set to paint out. I'm going to go up to the opacity, turn it on to 100. And now I can just paint that out from the areas that I don't want it to be applied to. Just like that. So now if I turn this off and on, you'll see that that curves filter is only being applied to this foreground area, bringing in some of that nice contrast, sort of that moody element to these little waterways in here. Now let's say we want to sort of modify this mountain area and bring some more detail into that. We can add a new local adjustment layer, and it's automatically set to darken. So I can actually just go up and I'm actually going to pull back on the opacity quite a bit for this. And then I can just paint sort of this darkening layer onto this mountain. We'll remove that from there. And we can pull up the adjustment a little bit. And now if I turn this off and on, it does a really good job of kind of removing that highlighted area in the mountain, but it's a little kind of wonky. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to remove this local adjustment layer. Oops. We're going to add a new one, set to darken, and we're going to grab our local adjustment gradient. You can also grab that by hitting Shift and K on your keyboard. And now we can just drop this down so it's applied to this entire area. And now we can go over here and we can modify the opacity. So about right there. Boom. Pull up on the shadows just a little bit so it matches kind of the bottom area of the photo. Cool. Now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, does a good job of really kind of, modifying this top area without modifying the bottom area. And we've really revealed a lot of those shadow tones in our photo. So now let's go into effects real quick. And let's add another filter. And let's go in and let's actually add a split tone filter here. And this photo is great for split toning because it has a lot of sort of defined shadowy areas right here in these trees. And then we also have this mountain area up top and our sky, which could be our highlights. So one of my favorite styles inside the split tone is this warm split tone. And I really like what that does to this sort of bottom area in the photo. And split toning can be explained just by simply seeing that your highlights are a different color and your shadows are a different color. So in this split tone filter, basically you're choosing a color for your highlights and you're choosing a color for your shadows. And then you're kind of overlaying that onto your photo to stylize it. So if I go into my highlights here and I click on this, and we'll just go to a color picker here, and I move this color around. See that by moving that color around, I'm modifying the color that's applied to the highlights in my photo. So you'll see up top here, this will be a good area to look at, is this mountaintop area, that if I move it to red, it turns that a little bit red of a tinge. And if I turn it to blue, same thing. So we'll reset this here, go into warm. And what I want to do to these shadows is I want to make them a little bit less dark. And I want to make them a little more blue. So now if I turn this off and on, it adds a nice amount of style to this photo and really kind of brings out some of those colors in this bottom area in the foreground. And I can actually in the split tone filter, for my highlights, I can pull up on this to give it even more or less. what I want to do is I actually want to go down to my mode area in here, and I'm going to choose a different mode for the split toning. And I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to choose color. So now if I turn this off and on, it's strictly just applying the color. You'll notice that if I go back to normal, it kind of gives it that hazy look a little bit. And so that by doing this sort of mode and clicking color, it's strictly applying the color and there's no sort of haze over your photo. So I have a question here. Let me see if it goes in here. So Ron asks, when using the local adjustment, the mask is black so you can't see what effect the adjustments will look like till you paint them in. Do you ever invert the mask to white temporarily to see what the adjustments will look like? Then invert it back when you start to paint the effect in. So when using local adjustments, the mask is black so you can't see. So a good way to avoid that, Ron, is if you're trying to paint in local adjustments here. So let's go, we'll add an adjustment and we'll just make it maybe lighten and we'll pull down the opacity. So let's say I'm trying to paint in an adjustment or an effect or a filter, and I want to see where I'm painting that in. A good way to do that is to go up to your top menu here, click mask, and then go down to view mode and then select red overlay. And now if I go in and I paint in like a local adjustment, oops, I got to view my mask first. So now if I go in and I paint a local adjustment in, by painting it in, it's going to remove that red from wherever I'm painting it in. So that'll show me where that adjustment is actually being painted in. I mean, this is kind of a terrible example and it's not really natural, but it gives you the idea. I hope that answered your question, Ron. If you guys have any more questions or anything like that, please feel free to hit up the Q&A and I can answer them kind of throughout this. So thanks, Ron. Okay, so let's remove this local adjustment here. And let's grab a new photo. And let's grab this one. And I grabbed this particular photo just to kind of give you guys a good idea of kind of how to reveal shadow tones in a photo without kind of compromising your exposure. So this particular shot, it's pretty underexposed, but we can kind of see some of the details in here. Well, I was shooting it sort of at the light because I wanted this light to kind of reveal this line and then kind of go into this watery area. So what I typically do, especially if the photo's a little underexposed, is I like to actually head down and I'll pull back on my contrast. So you'll see that by pulling back on my contrast, I'm revealing a lot of those darker tones in my photo. And pulling back on the contrast really allows you to, modify those darker tones without actually, modifying your exposure or your overall brightness in your shot. And so now I can go in and obviously when you're pulling back contrast, you're going to remove some of that pop from your shot. Well, no fear, because you can always go back and you can apply, dynamic contrast. You can paint in detail. What I typically do is I'll go up and I'll pull up on the shadows a little bit more, like that, maybe a little bit of midtone. And then I'll head down to my black slider here, and I'm going to pull back on my black slider, and this is going to bring in some more detail and contrast to my photo. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, really kind of done a good job of revealing a lot of those darker tones in my photo. And the great thing about using this method is that besides, staying a clean, crisp image by pulling back on your contrast and then just modifying the blacks a little bit, let me show you if I would have done it the other way and pulled back on the exposure to kind of reveal this area a little bit more and then pulled up on the shadows. If I zoom into this area right here, the more you pull back on your exposure and the more you reveal shadows, you're going to get a hint around your foreground. So if I pull back on the exposure more and I pull up on these midtones and stuff, you'll see that in this area, you're getting haloing kind of around this foreground. And now if I apply detail, let's say I add structure, it's going to bring out a lot of that haloing as soon as you apply structure. So just be on the lookout for that whenever you're modifying the exposure in your photo when you're shooting towards the light. I typically like to go in and, like we were doing earlier, just pull back on the contrast, add a little bit of shadow, a little bit of midtones, and then I can add some blacks to bring in some of that detail. Okay, so now we have sort of our foundational look for our shot here. I'm actually just going to go down and I'm going to pull up on the temperature just a hair. There we go. We've kind of set our foundational look for our shot. Let's actually go in and crop this a little bit. I was going to do that earlier and I kind of forgot. So I'm just going to crop this. Maybe about right there. Boom. Now we have sort of a nicely cropped photo here. And the next thing I want to do is I want to play with the detail and I want to play with the color, but I want to do it selectively. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to head into our effects tab here. And I want to apply a good amount of detail to sort of these rocky areas and then this sandy area, but I don't want it to be applied to the water or these clouds. So we're going to add a filter here. We're going to add dynamic contrast. And if I turn this off and on, I love it. Does an awesome job of bringing in some of that detail to my photo. But like I said earlier, I don't want it to be applied anywhere but, this foreground area. So like we were doing earlier, we're going to grab our masking brush by hitting B on our keyboard. We're going to increase the brush size. And now I'm simply just going to brush this out from the areas that I don't want it to be applied to. So now if I view my mask, you'll see that it's only applied to that area up there and it's not being applied to the foreground area at all. So now I'm actually going to go into my dynamic contrast filter here. And if I turn this off and on, it does a good job of bringing out some of those details. Well, let's actually modify this filter a little bit. I'm actually going to pull up on my small, which is basically going to bring in some more small detail into my photo. And another thing, I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to go into this tone area. And this is where you can actually modify the tone of your dynamic contrast filter. So a lot of people don't know that you can add detail with dynamic contrast, but you can also modify the tonality of those areas that it's applied to. So I'm just going to go in and I'm actually going to pull up on the vibrance because I think this photo needs a lot more color. So now if I turn this off and on, boom, we've really added a lot of detail and color to this photo simply by using one filter. Now we don't really have to do a whole lot to this shot, but since we are, for the sake of this video, modifying a landscape photo, let's go ahead and get a little wild with it and start applying different adjustments. So I'm going to add another filter here. And this filter, I want to deal with the color in the water. So we're going to add a color enhancer filter. And we're actually going to go and we're going to go down to our dynamic contrast mask here. I'm actually going to go into it and we're going to copy that mask. So this is going to copy this mask here. And now if I go into my color enhancer filter and I go into my masking options and I select paste, now I'm going to have this area. Oops, I need to invert it. Now if I select paste and I invert it, now if I view this mask, it's strictly being applied to this area on the bottom and not this area on the water. So, oops, I need to invert it again. Sorry guys. So now what we're going to want to do is we're going to go in and we're going to actually boost this color temperature or cool down the color temperature. And we're going to bring a lot more blue into our water. Pull up on the vibrance quite a bit. Then we'll go down to our color range here. And then our blues, we're actually going to pull up on the saturation and then on the brightness as well. So you'll see by pulling up on the brightness down here, we're actually modifying the brightness of that specific color. Boom. So now if we turn this off and on, you'll see that that color is only being applied to this area over here. And on the water, and not being applied anywhere on our foreground. Okay, so I have a couple questions in YouTube right now. So the first question from Dave is there a shortcut key for paint in / paint out? Yes. So the shortcut for painting in and painting out with either your masking brush, basically anything that you're brushing, is Shift. So if I hold down Shift and I hit X, Shift and X, and it will switch from paint in to paint out. And this works for a lot of different things like your refine tools. This will switch your modes from paint in to paint out to auto. So just Shift and X. And then Michael asks, can you show how I can use add mask? So basically, there's no button for adding a mask inside of ON1 Photo RAW. Basically, you just have to create the mask. And the way you do that is simply by using either your masking brush or your masking bug. So whenever we add a filter, so we'll just add another filter here. We'll just add, we'll add a glow filter. Now, by adding this glow filter, we'll turn it off and on. Actually, let's click lighter so you guys can see. So if we add this glow filter and we turn this off and on, it's being applied to our entire photo. So now if I go into my masking options for this filter, which is this sort of rectangle with a circle, and I view my mask, it's being applied to the entire, actually, let's go to mask view, sorry. Boom. So now if we go into view, it's entirely white. That means that the filter is being applied to my entire photo, because in masking, white reveals and black conceals. So now if I invert this mask and I view it, turn it off and on, nothing's being applied to my photo. So if I want something to be applied to this photo, I can either have it on invert to where it's applied to the entire shot, or I can invert it and then I can actually hold down Shift and X to make my brush paint in. And then I can actually paint that in wherever I want it. And now if I go into my mask and I view it, now I've actually created a mask where that filter is only being selectively applied to a certain area on my shot. So I hope that helps, Michael, on how to create a mask. Okay, so back to this photo here. What we're gonna wanna do now is actually wanna deal with sort of the look in the water and the look in the sky, and a quick little fix for kind of applying a polarizer to your photo without using a polarizer. I mean, you're not gonna get the same sort of effect, but you can actually add a filter, and you can add photo filter here. And one of my favorite filters here is if you go into more and you click polarizer. So if I turn this off and on, and let's just zoom in on the water here. If I turn that off and on, it really does an awesome job of bringing in some of that nice sort of silky smooth detail in this water here. But I don't want it to be applied to the foreground area again. So we're actually gonna go into our photo filter here. And we're actually gonna use a color range mask. So color range mask is just basically you're selecting a color and you're basing your mask off of all of the color in your photo. So if I want this photo filter, this polarizer photo filter to be applied to only this color out here, I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna grab my color range dropper, and I'm gonna drop it on this color in the water. So now if I go into my mask view here and I view it, it's only being applied to those areas on my photo that have that color specifically. And I can actually go down into my color range slider here and I can either give it more or I can give it less. In this case, we're gonna give it probably about the same as it was. 40 looks about good. So if I turn this off and on, oops. So if I view my photo again and I turn this off and on, you'll see it does an awesome job of kind of polarizing this area on the water here, but leaving this foreground area alone. So now what we can do is here deal with this area in the sky. It's a little bit bright over here. So what we can do is we can add a local adjustment layer. And like we were doing earlier, we're just gonna use our local adjustment gradient. Going to hit Shift and hit K. Now I have my adjustment gradient. And I'm just going to drop this down in this top area here. And if I turn this off and on, boom. Does an awesome job of kind of removing some of that highlighted exposed area up top without actually modifying this bottom foreground area. So let's turn this off and on. Awesome. Okay, so now what I want to do, just to finish this photo up, is I actually want to go in and I want to pull out some of the shadows in these areas on sort of this foreground with the darker tones. So I'm going to add a local adjustment layer. I'm going to go into the More, and I'm going to choose Reveal Shadows. And I'm actually just going to brush this on. The areas that are a little bit darker. And now I can go back and I'll just pull back on the opacity. If I turn that off and on, boom. Does a really good job of kind of bringing out those darker tones in this photo and kind of completing the image. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll see we've really done a lot to this photo in just a few different sliders, a few different effects. So let me check if we have any more questions here. So no more questions. I'm actually just going to go back and let's edit one more shot here. Just going to go back into Browse. And let's edit this photo. Okay, so this probably right off the bat doesn't need a whole lot of modifications. It's a beautiful, beautiful photo, probably right out of the camera. Oh, yep, it was right out of the camera, so it's a raw file. So we don't really have to do a whole lot to this shot. The first thing I want to do is I want to crop it. And just kind of like we were talking about earlier, cropping is pretty essential to landscape photos. And you wouldn't probably need to crop this photo. You don't have to crop it. But I'm noticing over here that there's a little bit of extra on this edge, and there's a little bit of extra on this edge here. So if we kind of drew a rectangle, I would probably draw it from this area here, up past this rock, over here, crop some of that top off, and then I would come down probably just below this little line here over here. So let's grab our crop tool by hitting C on our keyboard here. Oops. Okay, so I have a couple more questions real quick before I get into this. Okay, so Michael asks, how can I use the button add a new mask bug to an image? Okay, so to add a masking bug to an image, simply hit M on your keyboard. So M on your keyboard would grab your masking bug. And then Dave asks, another shortcut question, is there a shortcut to get you to the move tool to take you out of brush, crop, etc.? Yes, so typically the move tool, if you want to use layers, is V. So it's V on your keyboard to get to the move tool. And that just allows you to move your layer around. Boom. And then if you want to kind of just get out of the masking brush, sort of if you're just selected on one of these over here and you want to get out of it, I would recommend actually hitting Z. Z is going to grab your view tool here. So this is what you're going to have right here to zoom in and out of your photo is the Z tool. So I would recommend using Z instead of the move tool, which is V. And also, guys, if you are kind of looking for keyboard shortcuts or how to find them, all you have to do is hover over one of the tools, and it will give you that keyboard shortcut after the name of the tool. So you'll see here if I hover over crop, it's going to say crop tool in parentheses C. So that's just giving you the keyboard shortcut right there. And same thing as if you go into any of these tool section areas. So if I go into fix, if I go up to this top bar, it's going to give me clone stamp tool, shift and S. So if I hold down shift and I hit S, that's going to give me my clone stamp tool. So yeah, quick way to learn the keyboard shortcuts is just to simply hover over sort of whatever area you want to click on, and it will give you a keyboard shortcut for that. Okay, so keyboard shortcut for crop is C. So we'll hit C on our keyboard. And like I was saying earlier, I'm just going to pull this in just a hair. So I'm just going to hold down Shift, pull this in just a hair, and pull this over here by this rock. Boom. That's probably all you need to do as far as cropping goes. And like I was saying earlier, this is one of an amazingly exposed photo, so you don't have to do a whole lot to this photo. So I'm actually just going to head into my camera profile here again because it's a raw photo, and I'm going to select ON1 Landscape again. ON1 Landscape again just really kind of pulls out the vibrance in your photo, gives it a little bit more exposure. It's almost like adding the sunshine filter onto your shot. Boom. We probably don't have to do too much to this photo, but there's a few little areas that I would like to clean up. And the majority of those are in these darker areas sort of in my foreground here. So all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to head into my tone and color area instead of develop. And I'm just going to pull up on the exposure, or on the shadows, sorry. And the midtones. Just like that. Now we're going to add a little bit more contrast. And then we'll head down and let's just warm up this photo a hair. So now let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. We've done a good job of kind of revealing this foreground area, but what if we want to reveal, some of these highlight details in our sky? Well, what we can do is we'll go and we'll add a new local adjustment layer. And I'm going to click darken. I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient by hitting Shift and K on my keyboard. Then I'll just drop this down on our horizon line here. And if I turn this off and on, does an awesome job of revealing some of those highlight details in our sky. But it actually kind of darkens this area on our rock. So if I go back into develop here and I pull up on my midtones, you'll see that the midtones areas in my develop area, or the midtone slider, is basically controlling all of this gray area in my rock. So if I have the midtones up quite a bit, I'm going to reveal some more of that area. Well, the great thing about local adjustments is that you're going to have all of the basic sliders that you would have inside your tone and color. So I can actually go down, and now that I have my exposure kind of pulled back to remove some of those kind of blown out areas in my sky, I can go back and I can pull up on the midtones to reveal some of those midtone areas in my rock. So now that I have my midtones boosted up and my exposure down, I'm actually modifying this sky area selectively while also pulling out some of the detail from the mountain in the background. So now if I turn this off and on, maybe a little bit more midtones even then. And let's pull back on the contrast here. Maybe add some true black. There we go. And the next thing we could do is we can actually go in, and I want to apply some detail to this photo. But I don't want the detail to be applied to the sky area or anywhere in my photo that might crunch it up a bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go into effects here. We're going to add a filter. And we're going to add dynamic contrast. And like I was saying, we don't want this effect to be applied to our entire shot. We only want it to be applied selectively. So I'm going to actually go into my masking options here. I'm going to invert the mask. And now with our masking brush, and it's set to paint out, so we can hold down Shift, hit X. Now I'm set to paint in. And I can simply paint this dynamic contrast filter in to the areas that I want to pop with more detail. So now if I turn this off and on, does a good job of bringing out some of those details and making this photo pop a bit more. Now what I want to do is I want to deal with the color in this photo. And there's a few different ways that you can deal with color in ON1 Photo RAW. The first way is to simply add a color enhancer. I'm just going to add a filter here, going to add a color enhancer. And I specifically want to boost out the greens in my photo. These green areas in here, I'm just going to kind of give them a little bit of boost, a little love. So I can either do that by going into this color enhancer and specifically choosing my greens, and then I can go down and I can pull up on the saturation. So if I zoom in here and I play with the saturation, you'll see that I'm specifically targeting those green areas in my photo. But there's a few different shades of green. So my preferred way of dealing with color is to use a color range mask. So we're going to do that by zooming in on a sort of neutral area of green. And we're going to go into our masking options. We're going to choose a color range mask again. We're going to grab our dropper tool, and we're just going to drop it on sort of a neutral green area. So now let's view our mask here. And if I pull back on the color range, we might need a different color. Let's actually just drop it over here. There we go. So now if we view that, there we go. A lot more separation going on there. So now we can mask this out. View this. And now I can go in and I can modify just those greens specifically. I'll pull up on the saturation, vibrance a little bit. If I turn this off and on, does a good job of kind of selectively applying that color just to this area of, the grass and such. Now there's another way that you can actually modify the color, and I like to do this way if I'm modifying skies. So what I'll do is I'll actually go and I'll add a filter. I'll add a curves filter. And a lot of people don't know this, but inside of the curves filter, you can actually choose to modify your RGB values. So I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to go to blue. And since I know most of the area up here in the sky are my midtones and highlights, well, I'm going to go into my curves filter here, and I'm going to drag up my midtone highlight point for my blues. And you'll see that by doing that, I'm really boosting that blue color in my midtones and my highlights. So we'll just pull up on it just a hair. And then we'll go into our red value, and we'll boost that up just a hair also. And now this is being applied to our entire shot. So we only want it to be applied to the sky area. So we have our masking brush selected, set to paint out. We can actually just brush this out then. So now if I turn this off and on, does a good job of kind of taking out that green color cast from our photo and just kind of applying a nice blue and a little bit of a pink tinge to it. Okay, so are there any more questions before I wrap up here? That's kind of the end of the webinar. If you do have any more questions, feel free to hit them in now. I have a question from Light Chaser. It says, is the local adjustment gradient the same as hitting the masking bug? So yes and no. And no as in the sense that your masking bug is going to be dealing with your filters. So anything that has masking in front of it, like your masking bug or your masking gradient, is going to be dealing with your filters, whereas your local adjustment gradient and your local adjustment brush are going to be dealing with your local adjustments. So they do the same thing. They do the exact same thing for each of those, but they specifically modify different filters and adjustments. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard just to see how we did with this photo. And voila. Done a good job of kind of pulling out a lot of those tones and stylizing it. All right, guys. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'm just going to kind of wrap it up here. But I appreciate you guys staying and watching the entire webinar. Keep in mind that it is being recorded, so if you did have to miss any of it and you want to watch it again, it's going to be posted to our blog and our Facebook. So stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more webinars. We do have one every week. Next week's, I think, has to deal with brushes and masking. So if you do have any masking questions or kind of want to learn more about that, feel free to register for that webinar. All right, guys. Well, have a great weekend. I really appreciate you guys joining me and hope you guys learned some stuff. Thanks so much.